Good evening and welcome to Poetry at the Dalí. I'm Hank Hine, I'm the museum director. It's a pleasure to have you here. This program is becoming more and more distinguished every year, thanks to you as the audience, both here present and at home online, and to Helen Pruitt Wallace, the curator of our program. It is our tradition here to ask Helen to read a poem or two prior to introducing these very distinguished poets. We have very appreciatively are we of Tambolo Books for presenting Daniel Tobin's book, The Mansions, which is available out in front, and Tana Jean Welch's book, The Parachutes Descending. These beautifully designed books are available out there for a very reasonable price. Do you remember what poetry chapbooks used to look like? They're like, here's my book that was looking really good, but we ran out of ink because the Chandler Price, now doesn't use rubber ink anymore. And anyways, exquisite books, and I think you're in store for some exquisite poetry. Helen, would you come forward, please?
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Poetry at the Dalí. We're so happy to see you. We've got an amazing program tonight with Tana Welch and Daniel Tobin. Really terrific poets. I'm super excited to hear them read from their work. I want to just do a shout out to the City of St. Pete. Thank you for supporting our program. We are going on 10 years now, almost. I mean, that's amazing. So we're very grateful, and I'm especially grateful to this museum, especially Dr. Hine, and also to Dr. Kim McCrary, who is somewhere. You'll see her, and Joy Douglas, yes, they're in the back. Thank you both so much for all you do for the poetry program and the other programs here at the museum. And to our tech czars who are always helping us, because we record this. There'll be a live stream of this program. So for those of you who are tuning in now, we thank you. And if you know other folks who had hoped to be here and couldn't, please make sure that they know they can find this on our Dalí YouTube channel. So I will read one short poem per Hank's request. Thank you, Hank. And since Mother's Day is coming up, I'm going to read a short poem about my mother. And it's actually a concrete poem. It's shaped like a pot. It's called Stirring the Soil. In my mother's house are many pots, tureens of fern, anthurium, jade, and planted in the dirt beside stems lie jagged bits of ancestry, chips of pale blued cups, yellow plates, the handle of an antique crystal vase. She stirs the dry soil with the shards, then buries them like holy fertilizer, vital as the sun and drops of water. They are the host for lost communicants, these pieces of my mother's former life. And though they once were fragile, she's learned to expose their sharpest edge. She lifts a broken saucer to the light, a white one with minute salmon whorls, then pokes it through moss and into soil, surrounding a bromeliad, its bold mouth pink with morning sun. And I'm drawn to help her tamp the wedge, to nudge the cracks veining through the gloss, and learn from her how beauty blooms with loss. In my mother's house are many pots. Thank you. Thank you. I was lucky to have an amazing mother, and in fact, her mother has a lot to do with why I write. And she left several diaries. The first one written in 1912, and then her mother before her wrote one in 1887. And so I have those and have started gradually sort of looking into them and sometimes write poems off of them. So anyway, but to the reason we're here tonight, I'm going to start by introducing Tana Welch. She will be our first reader, and then we'll have Daniel. These two poets they're so amazing, and they have some interesting overlaps that I think you might hear in their poems because they're both not only poets, but they're also both amazing scholars in very different areas. Tana Jean Welch is the author of the poetry collections In Parachutes Descending, University Pittsburgh Press, that's huge, 2024, and latest Volcano, Marsh Hawk Press, 2016. Her poetry has appeared in the New York Times and in journals including the Southern Review, the Gettysburg Review, Beloit Poetry Journal, Prairie Schooner, and the Colorado Review. Her critical analysis of poetry and medicine, advancing medical posthumanism through 21st century American poetry, was published by Palgrave in 2024 and places contemporary poetics in dialogue with biomedicine in order to create a framework for a posthuman affirmative ethics within the culture of healthcare. Born and raised in Fresno, California, she currently lives in Tallahassee, where she's associate professor of medical humanities at the Florida State College of Medicine. Please welcome Tana Welch.
Hey, thank you, Helen. I last read here 6 years ago with my husband, and my son was 3 months old, and he sat up here. So I just wanted to give them a shout out there in the back. That's Berkeley and Timothy. They both write books and music, so they're good guys. Okay, so this book, In Parachutes Descending, when I set out to write it, I wanted to really show the interconnectedness of everything to everything else. So the orgasm to climate change, to global capitalism, to art, to ecstasy. And I anchored that idea in a relationship between, I guess it's three people, but so there's a narrative that goes throughout. Oh, the speaker of the poems has left her husband. They were living in Boston, and she left her husband to be with a painter, Jane, in San Francisco. And the San Francisco-Boston aspect is important because I also wanted to show how place is interconnected with who we are and things that happen as well, time. So I'm going to read, the first group of poems will be about Jane, and the speaker's going to be in San Francisco reflecting on the experience. Okay. Am I loud enough? Yes. Okay, thank you. Sleeping with Jane. Last night I thought of you while Jane slow worked her tongue and fingers, slow within me an electric kitska dripping beeswax in diamonds and spirals on a goose egg shell, which isn't the same as the way you work me into a never-ending toxin, a layered alarm sounding bomb after bomb. Maybe I should stop comparing lovers, but aren't whole worlds brought into being by association and separation? As if everyone could be Frank O'Hara. As if Boston and San Francisco aren't two tremendous thighs because Harrisburg and Fresno both lack. Waves, bays, paintings by Richter and Sargent and Neal. San Francisco is warmer, so I live in the Mission, knowing I'd live in Pacific Heights if I had the money. Now Jane snores as I act on my body alone, pressing all that black, riotous sleep into the quiet form of daylight. A wave on a wave, I've collected you both. So when Jane wakes, I kiss her and think of you, knowing if I were in Boston, I'd kiss you and think of her. This next one is Jane and the speaker have sort of rented a studio so that Jane has a good view of Alcatraz Island to paint in San Francisco. Still life, turning life. Every morning, Jane is amazed to find the prison island persists, as if it were the brief petals of a poppy, a mayfly, and still. Each morning, the gray-whack rocks stand certain, so Jane wakes and paints Alcatraz, dabbing brown on blue, while I pretend I'm somebody's muse. Why wouldn't it be there? I ask, and she answers. I can't help thinking this world is an Anjou pear, plucked before it's ripe. Perhaps Jane is right to grasp the suddenness of sinking, but her awe shouldn't come from the dependability of islands. The incredible thing is what she can't see from this tidy window 5 miles across the bay. People clutching tour tickets and mapping escape routes, cormorants and night herons, blanket flowers, pansies, and tide pools, tinted by petroleum. Oil tankers split open and it's all still here, in one form or another. Even my body in this room, adapting to Jane and her constant turpentine smudge. Once, before Jane, I wanted to move to Canada or France, but then I knew I am leaving for another continent which is the same as this one, in which pipelines prevented from pushing through Nebraska find another route, like my body found someone else. Like the farmers in California switch to Spanish or Italian grapes as the weather warms indefinitely. Don't fret, the viticulturists say. Become Barbera instead, or there's Negro Amaro, Sangiovese, or simply blend Albarino with your Chardonnay. Trading one grape for another without seeing how the pieces remain scattered across the map. Okay. So although the speaker lived in Boston with her husband, she's from Fresno, like me. And so there's a Highway 99 that runs through the Central Valley of California. And so the speaker brings Jane home to see her mom. This poem is called Highway 99, Jane Visits My Valley. Tiny teeth marks, gnashing a hole in a paper fan purchased at the Fresno Fair. Boys in the cul-de-sac shooting rubber bands and rocks from PVC pipe guns. This is how I remember my childhood. A ravenous static, a static explosion. Killer sharks floating belly up in the sun-bleached fiberglass pool, blood on the slide, the wasp whipping the back of a knee, the smell of a rattlesnake stripped of its skin, the metal barrette, the light socket. When Jane was in the bathroom and my mother told me to leave Jane, go back to the husband in Boston because you are not a lesbian, I didn't remind my mother of her own infidelity, the mother-daughter shopping trips to meet her lovers in San Francisco. I didn't say, I never said I was a lesbian. There was only rubble, Jane bending to pick out a scrap of painted shirt as if it were soiled ivory from a grand piano, possessed of us both and ruined now. No one should feel that alone. I need a drink of water. Now we're at a party in San Francisco. Jane was handing someone a bouquet of sauté, gushing about Mueller's foreign cinema and Laszlo when I told her about the abortion. A party not the best place to breathe new disclosures, to say the baby would be 3 years old now. I moved to a conversation about metal maps and the cosmic center of Himalayan Buddhism, but at home, Jane wanted to know all about it. The belly of black sky, the ghost baby that crashed her friend's gala. By then, I could only speak in negatives, only walk through what never happened. The leafy plants were red, and Jane's blue gown was the color of flaming poppies, and I didn't want to keep it. And I didn't arrive at the clinic with a teenage boy who said, "We drove all this way. Stop crying. Act like a woman." The closest clinic wasn't 300 miles away. I took the subway. I didn't tell my husband. I didn't take a pill. I didn't shit or vomit. My hand was sweaty, and the speculum was icy, but there wasn't a tiny poster of a tropical island pasted on the ceiling. I don't know how I came up with the $700. The doctor didn't whistle Without Love or Springtime for Hitler while vacuuming my uterus, but I still shudder whenever I hear show tunes. The technician didn't tell me how large the head was, not a walnut, lemon, avocado, or ripened plum. I didn't have a boyfriend who wanted sex afterward, even when I said, no, it still hurts. Or a husband waiting in the waiting room, a husband asking, where do you want to go on vacation? Perhaps try the dry white wines of the Mediterranean coast. When it was over, a nurse didn't say, it was a shad, a snake, a sparrow, and a boy's closed eye. At dinner, we didn't say, let's have her, and at breakfast, no. More monster than murdered, safe in all silences. Oh, dear Jane, do you want to know I was covered in blood? Do you want to know about the tiny bright room, the women who were afraid, the girls who smiled? So in San Francisco, there is an order of queer and trans nuns called the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence. They've been around since 1979, and they devote themselves to community service, ministry, outreach, and promoting human rights. But every Easter, they have a party at a park, and they hold the Hunky Jesus contest, which is just what it sounds like. People go across the stage competing to be the hunkiest Jesus. So the poem I'm going to read, the title is Jesus Died on the Cross Because He Forgot His Safe Word. And that is from a sign someone was holding at the celebration. Jesus died on the cross because he forgot his safe word. Read the sign at the Hunky Jesus contest that Easter Sunday in Golden Gate Park, where Jesus, after Jesus performed his passion, twerked to shake that monkey, erected nipples in milk spray, bore his burden in fishnets and high heels, drained Cabernet from his biceps. A stage full of Jesuses who mostly look like they'd never say their safe word. Jane was looking for someone to paint, and I was just looking. Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence. What Jane said we could be, what we were together. And I liked the sound of it, a pitch better and cooler than I knew myself to be. A sound like a summit of ecstasies clad in leather moto pants. A blue-limbed star whipping, but by then I also knew Jane, and Jane and I together. And we weren't the same order as the cross-dressing nuns of fun throwing this party. Yes, we were good at drinking and eating and screwing, but I'd read their website. Being a sister isn't just securing wigs and corsets, but more, helping hospice and school, pushing raffle tickets, lining up porta potties. Like everything, indulgence is multiple with meaning, including the gratification of another. And while the sisters served others, Jane and I, like true Republicans, yielded only to our own desires. Like songbirds singing for territory, or goblins mating with Caligula. So when Jane winked and said we were sisters perpetually indulging, I knew, despite the display of Jesus's offering remission of all my sins, what I truly learned from sleeping with Jane was not relaxation of restraint, but that the muse poses only when she is bivouacked and wants to get out, which is what Jane and I both craved, to evade one existence for another. But having conquered this aura, this life of love away from love, what next? Where do we go? Which of us now needs a safe word and why? I think I have 5 minutes. In this book, there's a poem sequence that's woven throughout. It's called Seasteading. And seasteading, if you aren't familiar with it, is a libertarian movement to colonize the ocean as a way to evade taxes and regulation. If you look at the website, it doesn't say that in those exact words, but okay. Seasteading, the final frontier. Her lips move, and we know what she is saying, the woman in the hot pink skirt suit, her new blonde hair hired to boost the seasteading movement. Floating cities are the next frontier, she says, and senses the host of this cable news show about to interrupt, about to say something intended to highlight her gender. So she rushes the next line. All the surface area on this planet is occupied. She is good at her job, so his smug jowls rest while she speaks about the need for space, more space to experiment with new ways of living. But then the host reaches across the table, grabs, squeezes her hand in one oil-slick gesture. Tell me, dear, who is allowed to live on this floating city? Her lipstick flakes as the camera zooms in on her face, and we can tell it wasn't the pale hand of the host, but his question that woke in her eyes an animal kingdom of jealousy. as she fears both her own exclusion and the inclusion of all others in parachutes descending upon the high seas. Okay. Let's see, studying, subtitle is Ephemeral. Ephemeral was seasteading practice. Every year they would go out on the Sacramento River with their houseboats to practice for when they had their floating cities. They stopped doing it when COVID came, but seasteading ephemeral. Ephemeral is a floating celebration of community and seasteading. There are no tickets, no central organizers, and no rangers to keep you safe. Ephemeral prepares us for our future world through 5 days of floating on the Sacramento River Delta. You must practice radical self-reliance. You must build a boat. There's limited space. There are no rangers to keep you safe. You are free to do what you want. You must conform to the island commodore's rules. There are no rangers to keep you safe. You are free to do what you want. You can sleep in the nude. You can eat all of your food. You can carve trees in your calves with a switchblade or machete. You can hoard life jackets and flares. You can snort several lines of pure white Prague. You can keep your drawbridge raised. You can hoist a flag depicting buckteeth biting watermelon, but there are no rangers to keep you safe. You can dress your feet in pink 5 fingers. You can have 10 wives and your way with their daughters and sons. You can not give a shit. You can sink your boat. Okay, I'm just gonna do one more short one. Well, maybe short is a matter of opinion, but it seems for some reason it's not marked how it should be. Okay, it's called, hold on, The History of Humanity. While drought damages acres of asparagus, almonds, and oranges, while a teenage boy stashes the strangled next-door girl in a recycling bin, small under stacks of corrugated cardboard bearing the black Amazon smile, while a dentist from Minnesota pays $50,000 for the privilege of killing a lion, fire spread through Napa's vineyards, high-speed trains pick off Sudanese migrants, night after night. This is why I accept your torch moving through dangerous air, why I had 3 orgasms as southern Alaska had 21 earthquakes. Instead of asking when the hard choices will be made, I take the torpor of touch. I feed and pulse on the spasm of space and time until that generous juncture of black hole departure. With every climax, I can leave this world. Even as the earth's tremors deepen by miles, even as pink iguanas live on the precipice of extinction, even as lightning pulls us farther and farther apart. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tana. That was wonderful. And you know what, Timothy, I do want to give a shout out to you also and your son. What we were talking about before this started is that their son was a baby when you were here before, and it was really wonderful. But so great to see both of these, or to be able to talk about both of your new books that are coming out and that have just come out, and to hear you read these poems. So we're very happy that you came back. I do want to do a shout out first to our state poet laureate, Peter Meinke, who is here with us. And to the other writers who've joined us in the crowd. I can see some of you. I can't see everybody because of the lighting, but I'm very happy that you're here. So I think I see Brooks in the back there. I think I see Danny Lawless and some others. Anyway, welcome. Glad that you're here. Next, we have Daniel Tobin. Daniel is the author of 9 books of poems: Where the World is Made, Double Life, The Narrows, Second Things, Belated Heavens, which was winner of the Massachusetts Book Award in Poetry in 2011, The Net, 2014, From Nothing, published in 2016, and Blood Labors in 2018. Wow, you've been busy. The New York Times named Blood Labors one of the best poetry books of the year for 2018. The Mansions, his trilogy of book-length poems, appeared from 4-Way Books in 2023. He's also the author of the critical studies Passage to the Center, Imagination and the Sacred in the Poetry of Seamus Heaney, one of my very favorite poets. Awake in America and On Serious Earth, Poetry and Transcendence, a collection of essays. He's the editor of the Book of Irish American Poetry from the 18th century to the present, the selected poems and Lola Ridge and Poets' Work, Poets' Plays, essays on the practice and the art, and To the Many, the collected early works of Lola Ridge. The Stone in the Air, his suite of versions from the poetry of Paul Celan, appeared from Salmon Poetry in Ireland, and among his awards are the Discovery and the Nation Award, the Robert Penn Warren Award, the Robert Frost Fellowship, the Katherine Bakeless Nason Award, the Massachusetts Book Award, and the Julia Ward Howe Award, and creative writing fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts and the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation. He teaches at Emerson College. Please welcome Daniel Tobin.
Well, thanks everybody for being here. You can hear me. Yeah, okay, good. I'm going to read from the Mansions, and I want to thank Hank and Helen and Tana and Danny Lawless, who helped in getting me here, and also the audience for being here, especially my family and friends, some of whom I haven't seen in quite a long time. So I'm going to read from the second and third books. And the first selection I'm going to read from is called This Broken Symmetry, which is about the great philosopher, social justice advocate, and mystic, Simone Weil. And this works backwards in time. It begins after she died and ends before she's born, because she believed that there was more reality in the past than there will be in the future. And the second, I'm going to read from the third book, which is on the life of Teilhard de Chardin, who's a theologian, but primarily a scientist, a geologist. Most of his geological work was published in his lifetime. None of his theological work was published in his lifetime because it was censored by the church. He spent many years of his life in China. So the first selection I'm going to read is called By Brook, which is where Simone Weil was buried. She adored sunsets, and her last was a flaming host placed gravely on the ocean's tongue, indistinguishable from dawn, the vagrant star, the soul's final morsel. No longer now the wasted figure, self-starved, the sky spread above the ceiling, above the bed, the huge refuge, as though this plot had always been, would always be her portion, and all the vastness nascent in that fold, flowering emptily. I am a badly cut off piece of God. A wind blowing east across the channel to Gravelines stirs the border of native trees, stirs them classically. Their limbs broadcast nothing of the ancient news. Their bodies bend pliant with each prevailing sway. Let the universe be to my hand a blind man's stick, another body to my soul, my death of no importance. I am the color of dead leaves, an unnoticed insect. Now above her hollow in earth, a few friends circle, then kneel, where in time a belated stone will rest, where they pray now, where now one throws a bouquet to crest the plain wood box, and her slenderest stem cut that fixed her to her waiting, while the summoned priest, unshowing, turns back from his mistaken train through crowds, numb, that in time will be new crowds to settle beyond the trees in queues for cinema world. How grandly fleet the light in each commodious cave. Thank you. This second section, these are not individual poems, they kind of roll along, is called Decreation. And decreation was one of her central ideas, which doesn't mean going to death, it means going toward the uncreated, which is a different idea for her, not death. But to enter the uncreated, nothing's naked open sea, before God abandoned God to these various forms of hunger, gravity riveted plumb in every scattered part, and each flung I like a standing pole to blot the infinite, as if creation at its root were rooted in cross purposes. My great desire is to lose all will, lose all personal being. What at best is God but a beggar in this world, emergent as when an ocean recedes into itself and shores appear, never once again, but for the first time, a sloth, a seething, but in the self-possessed imagining of a universe beyond which in emptiness the beggar whispers secretly self's self-renouncing song, for only God can love God. Yet in this broken symmetry, our love, she said, should stretch across all of space, spread equally in every portion of it. So how does it manifest, this knowing of beauty, of bridges, all things metaxu, metaphors, to lead us out, and even evil a form of mercy? This world at once the barrier, the closed door, and the way through, from one to another and then to God. And this passing fictive I, born to really die, to be but a little pile of brute matter, how does it become the bird with golden wings that pierces through the egg of the world? It must wait, like Electra, for the dead Orestes to return. Like Christ in Gethsemane, God waiting in God's absence like a beggar, God waiting for God under the olive trees. The next section here, I'm going to read two more sections from this, is called Harvest. And it's sort of polyvocal. There are multiple voices speaking here. And this is in the voice of somebody named Gustave Tobin, who was a philosopher, French philosopher, and a friend of Simone Weil. Harvest. Like someone who has spent long hours among the vines, prematurely old, bent, that's how she looked to me that day we met in Avignon, who hadn't picked yet a single cluster, her face wan, faded like a fresco angel in the Palais du Pape. Only her eyes magnificent, only her eyes alone triumphed in that shipwreck of beauty with their look of something foreign to this world. She refused our room in San Marcel, chose the ruin, earthen-floored beside the wood, its scatter of rat merde, its pine needle mattress and peasant's hearth, that one small window from which she'd view the Rhone. Her fairy tale house, she'd say, rest, fresh fruit, delicious air, the fear she felt of losing herself among the sensual pleasures. One time, I found her sitting still on the tree trunk in front, lost in contemplation, and sensed just then a correspondence, the beauty of that soul and the landscape's tender majesty. But how raw her friends suffered her will for immolation, she who chided me for withholding my true measure of stripping myself away. For her, the beauty of the world was the mouth of a labyrinth. In the center, there God waits to eat the soul. So in Saint Julien, she joined with harvesters, disappearing among the rows of pendant grapes, embodied wine, cutting free the perfectly nurtured bruise-colored fruit, hour by hour, for days, her sandaled feet bleeding, purifying her, she'd say, until I see the landscape as it is when I'm not there. And maybe I'm a little perverse, but I thought that since I'm in the Dalí Museum, I would read a poem in the voice of Pablo Picasso. There you go. Pablo Picasso, to my knowledge at least, never met Simone Weil, but they shared a vicinity in Paris, the Luxembourg Gardens. So this is a fiction right? That maybe Picasso kind of watched her and saw her. And Picasso was rather an indulgent person, right? And Simone Weil, you might have gotten even in these few selections, was very ascetic, actually starved herself to death. And sympathy for those dying in World War II. She was born in 1909, died in 1943. I'll start the Teilhard in a minute, and there's a bit of an overlap. He was older, but all of these people share a moment in history when great, tremendous things of awful nature were happening and great, tremendous scientific strides were simultaneously happening. This is Pablo Picasso, I hope. Between my first name and last, a litany of saints unfolds like patrons in a deck of prayer cards. Maria of the Cures, Cyprian of the Holy Trinity, Joseph, Francis, James, John, Mother, Father, so many, I might be my own apostolate. I am who I am, Minotaur Pontifex of this apostate world who ventures any tangent out to make the greatest art. From the cave walls of Dordogne to Bosch to Goya to this, my Guernica. See how the gored horse rears and screams, how the dismembered soldier stretches, knife in one hand, stigma in the other, how arms raised, the screeching one burns alive in gray fire as the grieving woman floats below the bull's head, agonizingly, as though wrapped in carnal ecstasy, with the bull looking off into space as if into a mirror, the ghost face, the torturer's light bulb, the all-seeing hovering over all. This bull is a bull, this horse a horse. Don't ask the meaning, though if I wished I could paint like Da Vinci in his Last Supper, all tangents converging on the Christ's face, serene, the hidden form Pythagorean. In mine you can see subliminal that ghostly human skull. The infinite, which is in man, is at the mercy of a little piece of iron, the whole being stricken, a harrowing pain, and no place for God. That is something of what I heard her, she said, she who I saw crossing the gardens, cistern eyes not unlike my Dora's. I could paint her, riven ensemble, gazing beyond the frame. So I'll read some now from At the Grave of Teilhard de Chardin, and the first section of this actually is voiced by inanimate objects. The second section is by friends, and the last section is by now the poet addressing Teilhard as though Teilhard were his confessor in a confessional. And that goes on for 11 sections, and you'll be very happy to know I won't be reading them all. But this is his stone, his gravestone talking, and that opens the book on Teilhard, so to speak. Again, this dawn lit incandescence through the yew trees, and down the slope the river scrolling the length of itself in every pearl and ripple. When, years ago, they set me to attest his life among the growing human increase under grass, I had long been lifted from the ground mass, soft-grained, sun-blanched, vaguely crystalline, his name cut into me plainly with his beginning and his end, and the frozen earth unwilling to lay him to rest, for this man to sleep the sleep of trust, the sleep of seed in the winter field. It is a terrifying thing to be born, to find oneself without having willed it, swept along, still I hear him say, on a torrent of fearful energy. Or maybe I only think I hear him, as if I were his god of iron, a childhood's distant dream, infinitely durable, not my weathering granite shield against effacement. What comes at the very end, he said, is the adorable. To this padlocked field behind the shuttered church, I watch them swing the gate and scan the identical rows along the tarred path pillowed by decades of moss until they find me, each one leaving their gift of stone on my crest. And sometimes it is in that stillness as if I am the river moving along with the layers, light pouring over me, pouring through me, light speeding from so far away, it has no past or future. And this one is called Hands, and it's voiced by a colleague in China, fellow geologist and anthropologist and surveyor of fossils, George Barber. To fall forward stage by stage till the end of the world, that's what he would say, my old friend with his kit box and breviary, his pack of jobs, him chain-smoking them year in, year out, from Tianjin to Transvaal, field notes and skulls, his eyes keen for every jigsaw bit of bone. Sinanthropus, Australopithecus, Miocene, Pleistocene, all the way to this later infancy, this thinking envelope of consciousness expanding he held like a living net. One mind woven with all minds, drawn to the ahead. At Chukutian, I used crayons to track sediment with colors on my notepad. He would keep gradations like prisms in his head, drawing sharp as photographs. Nights at the fire, we would talk of his god of tension that carries the species on through every random spur, like that time on the steps of the Yamen when a mule struck him with its hind legs on the temple, the blister the size of a bloody pigeon's egg. He quoted Li Po. It's as hard to travel to Sichuan as to climb to heaven. And when my son died, near his own death, he wrote, I am convinced what looks like meaningless catastrophe transforms itself into blessing. And even those graves at Singling, no stones, no names. Look at the hands, spit painted on cave walls as if raised to brace a fall. No, they're moving. They're making their way through rock. So I'll read two more, and this one is called La Cote, and this is in the voice of an islander who took Teilhard to a cave in Guernsey, which was a Neanderthal cave, and it kind of spurred his imagination about the depths of time. I will also confess that 23andMe suggests that I have 62% more Neanderthal in me than anybody else on 23andMe. So Cousin Patty, look out, just letting you know. This is for my people, okay. La Cote. Not the grotto at Puerto Viesco, its red ochre paintings of horses and deer, nor the rearing bison at Altamira, their contours in chiaroscuro on Magdalenian stone. Not the limestone honeycomb of hills near Les Espas, its nuptial hall, where the man with reindeer antlers and horse's tail strides by leopards in a lithe cortege, nor Dragonbone Hill, white quartz amidst the karst, the slung-back skull of Nellie beside ash and bones, nor Sind Irrawaddy Makapan, its cave of hearths, but here, in the channel, at La Cote de Saint-Brelade, its collapsed granite headland of metamorphic rock, did he glimpse the prospect of a past before the past. That night, when we went fishing under a risen moon, I pointed out the passage, its jagged compass angle gaping above the shingle. Inside, our latest cousins mastered flint and fire, heavy-browed, bigger-brained than us. Think of gazing out from those ranging eyes for generations, their burial ground now under ocean that then was rushing stream. Blessed are you, harsh matter, stubborn rock, he wrote that here, and held the past is more beautiful, but the future is more beautiful still than all the pasts. Then what is God, I would ask him. And I see him now in caravan turning. God, he says, is a note of music, his hand tracing a spiral in the air. And I'll finish with this poem, which is a palindrome. It's the last poem in the whole design of the thing. And a palindrome is essentially a mirror poem. So the beginning of the poem proceeds halfway, and then it turns around and proceeds to the beginning again. So you turn it around infinitely, right? It's an eternal return, so to speak. This also, you may hear, also the last part of the book is entirely in terza rima, which was Dante's chosen form for the Divine Comedy. So, and this is sort of the poet talking now, coming clean. Some wellspring of creation, lithe in the scattered sunlight. It pours itself at dawn along this single inlet shore, the rising sun being born, center of deep delight at the heart of the world, and the water a mirror entirely reflecting sky. Here again is your paten, here again your chalice in the vessel of matter in which the all is emptied, nothing abandoned. Beyond these harbor islands, it is the human city, visible from the tidal hallows here at world's end, that feels like the planet, the passing planet we must grieve right now, now that the planet too has risen. Let me hold in my gaze some filament of eternity. Let me hold in my gaze some filament of eternity right now, now that the planet too has risen, that feels like the passing planet we must grieve. Visible from the tidal hallows here at world's end, beyond these harbor islands, it is the human city in which the all is emptied, nothing abandoned. Here again your chalice in the vessel of matter entirely reflecting sky. Here again is your paten at the heart of the world, and the water a mirror. The rising sun being born, center of deep delight. It pours itself at dawn along the single inlet shore. Some wellspring of creation, live in the scattered sunlight. Thanks.
Daniel, thank you. That was amazing, amazing reading. So many powerful poems from both of these poets. We're going to segue now into our Q&A with you guys. So if you will, please, raise your hand, and then Joy in the back will come around with a microphone, because otherwise the folks who are tuning in on our Dalí YouTube channel won't be able to hear the questions. So yes, Hank, please. Here comes Joy.
I like that phrase, here comes joy. I'm waiting.
That's our mantra at the Dalí Museum.
That's right.
Here comes joy. So, Tana and Daniel, I know that Helen mentioned that there were correspondences in the poetics that you share. One of the things that I noticed was both your allegiance to other disciplines, that scientific ones, but also your use of multiple voices. And one of the covenants that one has as a poet with the audience, I think, is always the sense that a voice is the poet's voice. So would you tell us about how the multiple voices are both your voice and the voice of others, or whether they are all some inner voices for yourselves as writers?
Okay, are we supposed to use?
Yes, you can use it, yeah. And you can just-
There you go. Actually, no, I'll just grab the whole thing.
There you go.
Okay. The question was if some of the voices are our voices that are supposed to be other people's voices? Like how much of the voice is actually ours?
I think that's,
I wanted to give a little more license than that simplification. I wanted you just to speak about multiple voices and to what extent you possess them, or to what extent they belong to the world or to your inner self.
Okay. For this book, there are other poems, not that many, but there are poems where the husband gets to talk, and Jane. And then there's poems that most all the poems are the speaker, but there are some, like the seasteading poems, are just anybody. But the only way I can answer your question is that all the voices are their own, but I might filter some of my ideas through them and to like get my agenda out there. Other than that, like with this book especially, I was trying to really imagine specific characters and how they would act and talk. And then there's different details from my life that I would have borrowed, like being from Fresno, just because that's what I know, or San Francisco or Boston, but that's all. He might answer your question better.
You use the term possessed, and I think for me, it's an activity of trying to be possessed by the voices. So, and I don't know how one exactly does that, but I do know for me there was quite a bit of research that had to take place in order for me to write all of those 3 book-length poems. So, and they have multiple voices, as you noted. So, I had to research each one of those people, and I had to research them in relation to the individual, whether it's Simone Weil or Teilhard de Chardin, or the first person, Georges Lemaitre, who is a physicist and a Jesuit priest in the first section. So, and then also to sort of be possessed by the obsessions of the major figures around which the poems have been written, or the sections of the long poems have been written. So I kind of liken it to an attempt at emptying myself as possible, which we know is impossible, but in order to kind of move through the membrane a little bit between lives that are very distant and my own life. But that said, I wouldn't have written any of this stuff if I had not been obsessed myself with the questions that their work posed, and the circumstances of the lives of the individual people who also speak, including that, for example, that islander. I had to sort of imagine myself back entirely into some earlier part of the 20th century when, someone would be rowing a boat from one side of Guernsey off of France to another side of Guernsey. I've never even been to Guernsey. So I had to try and, do the Vulcan mind meld with that guy somehow or other. Hopefully I made it.
Yeah. That's a great question, Hank, and I was wondering, it's in a similar way, because I know that you are both scholars, I'd like to, maybe you could explain a little bit to us, Tana, about your research that you do in posthumanism and medical studies, and how the research that you do in that arena that you also teach at FSU, I get the feeling that also informs your poems and does add to the voices, the many voices that Hank is referring to, because some of that research is then what you use to get the ideas across from people who may or may not be also speaking your tongue. If you could both talk a little bit about how your research, and then Daniel, yours, and theology, and all of your research with the Irish American writers, and kind of a total immersion into the study of transcendence and questions and a mystical approach. All of that research that you've done over the years is also informing many of your poems. I'd like if you could kind of answer it the same way, but bringing a little bit more of your particular studies into your answer, starting with you, Tana, if you don't mind.
Okay. Before the reading, Hank asked me about posthumanism, and I think I flubbed it a little bit. It's a really large topic with lots of elements, but in terms of medicine, the idea is using a posthuman ethics to make certain choices in terms of medicine, and there's so many elements involved, so I'm not going to go into that because I'm not in that mindset. But as far as the book goes, I did start studying posthuman theory at the same time as I started writing the book, and I've been doing it the last 8 years or so, and then that book came out this year as well. But one of the elements is the interconnectedness of everything and how we are constantly changing based on what we come in contact with. And I hope that's what this book is conveying. And the other thing is being open to change and making decisions that are taking into consideration everything. Thing is important, every non-human human thing, and how that's affected. And I hope that's also in here. So the ideas definitely inform the topic. I don't know if that.
Into the different voices that appear in your book, yeah. That's good.
Well, and I think in the case of these three books that form one larger design, it's sort of a culmination of, I'm a little older than Tana, it's a culmination of a long time thinking and being obsessed by what I would regard as ultimate questions of our being here, which I don't think is necessarily different than Tana's. It just takes a different sort of direction, maybe. So I have been interested in theological questions when they grew out of my being a child, asking rudimentary sorts of questions that I think everybody asks. And then in turn, my first reading of Teilhard was when I was in college. I didn't write anything about him until I was well after college, in the vicinity of 45 years after college or close to that, right? So to allow those obsessions to percolate. But that required also a willingness to risk, in some cases, difficult theological formulations and bring them into poems and somehow render them in a way that are, even if one isn't particularly theologically oriented, you feel compelled by the human circumstance of the poems, right? And the second sort of order of interest for this book in particular was the interest in science, specifically physics, and questions of how species evolve eventually with Teilhard de Chardin, and also which comes into some of the poems, some of the sections of the poems. And in the case of the first book, which I didn't read from, Georges Lemaitre, as I said, was a Jesuit priest, but he's really a brilliant scientist. Einstein thought his math was better than his, but he's not exactly a household name. And I think that's because, well, he didn't really fit entirely perfectly well with the scientific community because of the nature of his life. But he was the first person to actually conceptualize that the universe began in an explosive singularity, what we now call the Big Bang. And he is noted for that in some circles. And so he would have been working against the prevailing view of the time, which was steady state theory. And steady state theory was advanced by somebody named Fred Hoyle. And he got the idea actually from watching a movie called Dead of Night, in which the beginning of the movie ends up being the end of the movie, and it just keeps going around and around and around infinitely. And so the idea that the entire universe is a steady state, it never actually changes or merely recycles endlessly. The prevailing scientific view now is that it is a Big Bang, and it is, and we conclude that from the cosmic microwave background radiation and so forth, which was discovered in 1966, right shortly before Georges Lemaitre died, by a son of a survivor of the Holocaust in an array in New Jersey. So I'm interested in history too, therefore. And I'm interested in the intersection of how people try to aspire to gain the most compelling and comprehensive view of what it means to be alive, human and non-human, and at the same time we do awful things to each other, and we don't seem to back off from that particular proclivity either. So that's where the gist of it all comes from. Unavoidable, I guess, for me.
Interesting, and very informed by research again. And I'm questions from you all, and I may have a follow-up to that. Other questions? Anybody? Yes, in the back. Brooks?
Hi, this isn't so much a question, it's just an, I'm sorry I missed most of the first half, and I apologize for that. but I wanted to ask Daniel about the use of mythology and archaeology, and there was a wonderful way that you tied it all together. And that last poem about the Chinese archaeologist, is that what it was?
Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned Zinjanthropus, I think?
Synjanthropus is
I,
one of
just-
our iterations.
Right, is that the one that Mary Leakey found in Olduvai Gorge?
I thought that was Australopithecus, but you're thinking of,
It was a tiny skull, as I recall.
that was Synanthropus, yes.
Yeah, I just thought that was amazing how you were able to tie all of these different scientific concepts, but make it poetic. You know, most people don't think of archaeology as a poetical thing, but it really tied in. And when you mentioned the labyrinth, and which made me think of the Minotaur and the bones that would have been in there, and then I think of stories I'd heard that the Greeks would find bones of ancient animals that had prehistoric animals, and that's one of the reasons they thought the gods, the Titans, were so gigantic, because of these bones that they couldn't explain. But anyway, I wanted to ask you, now that I remember, is that what you teach at school? Do you teach, besides theology, do you also teach mythology?
I don't teach theology. I suppose theoretically I do have a master's in theology. So theoretically I could do that, and I have a doctorate in religion and literature, so theoretically, but I've never done it. I've always taught poetry and literature. So, so not directly mythology either, but I think you read enough poetry, right? There's quite a bit of mythology that gets into poetry, so you have to talk about that, and that's part of the, I suppose, the education of a potential poet, is to trust that they will be willing to venture into areas that they may not initially be familiar with, and some of that might be mythology. Also would say, there are lots of mythologies, and so to draw from many bodies of knowledge is a good thing from my perspective for a poet or any artist. And the other thing I would say, I guess, is that if you do that, somehow you have to find a way to make it relevant, or discover a way rhythmically in the language so that you can allude to some mythological piece of knowledge and allow your reader to absorb it and believe it, even though they may not know it precisely. And then, after that, be willing to maybe venture into learning a bit more about it, though that's not necessarily the end of the poem, but it might be a vector or a door that the poem opens for a person who reads it.
Thank you, that's great.
Good answer. Other questions? Yes, Kira?
You both noted having family in the audience today, and I wondered how their presence might change or not change what you would read.
Well, he has an iPad back there. It's funny, though, because I was thinking about it, because I didn't know if I wanted him to hear all these poems. And then I decided that he wasn't paying attention anyways. And we're walking to the museum from the parking lot, and he said, "Are you going to read the same poems you read in Sarasota?" And I said, "Maybe some of them. I don't really remember what I read." And he's like, "Well, I know." And he started telling me the poems. I'm like, "Oh, I guess you are listening." But it was too late to change. So, but if we talk a lot, I think it'll be okay.
Well, I've stayed the last couple of days with my cousin Patty and her husband Fred, and they've been so welcoming, and it's been a long time since we've seen each other, at least 15, maybe 20 years. Oh, wow. So that's been influential in other ways beside poetry, but I will say that I had an idea that I was only going to read from the second book. And that was my kind of headspace, and then being here for the last 3 days, I changed it and read some from the second and some from the third. And one of the reasons why that happened is that my cousin Patty's a wonderful photographer, and she has a lot of beautiful photographs that show the sky and the medial space of trees and sky reflected in pools of water. And so that's essentially what a palindrome does. And the last section I read was the palindrome, which is a mirror poem. So that was without my having to say it, I wanted to be that little homage to,
Oh, nice.
to Patty.
That's lovely. Yeah. Other questions? I'd like to return, or make a turn a little more toward craft, if you guys don't mind. And it is tied, in my mind anyway, to what we were talking about with respect to research. Because, I mean, the internet makes it really easy, right, to do a lot of great research on our poems. And I'm guessing you both use that. And maybe Tana, with you, I know that you write a lot about global warming, climate changes, a lot of health issues. You dovetail with your scholarly work into your poems as well. And then Daniel, your research on everything that you've already kind of covered, and you did kick a little bit into craft a few minutes ago, because the challenge is you can't just do the research and stick it in a poem, right? You have to somehow find ways through craft to make it believable and not didactic, and have it feel like a poem and take on the. Can you both talk a little bit about how you go from the research stage in your poems to then working into poems that you feel like hold their own in terms of voice and what you're trying to say and the craft of the poem? And I think as part of this, if you're so inclined, tap into form a little bit, if you will, please. And whomever wants to go first. So.
I'll go.
Okay.
Is this on? Oh, yes. So I do use the internet a lot of research, and it's interesting your question about how to make it not be researchy or sound more scientific. But what I do is I have a topic I'm interested in. I do a lot of research. I take a lot of notes. Freehand is how I do it for some reason. And I get a stack of papers, and then I just put it away, and then I try to write the poem without looking at the papers so that it's more natural sounding and organic. And then time is just a big factor. You write something, at least I do, and it goes away. In a couple of months you look at it, a year you look at it, and it gets whittled down into more of a poetic piece in that way. So that's how I do that. And I think form would work the same way. I move poems in and out of forms during that years long process of revision, and it finds its way to the right form eventually.
Yeah. Thank you.
Interesting. I mean, I also, in the research part, obviously reading a lot of books, also went to Lemaitre's archive in Louvain-la-Neuve in Belgium. He was a Belgian physicist and priest. So I had to go there. I wanted to go there and see actual work in his handwriting, which I did, and wrote down notes. I couldn't take anything, obviously, but I wanted to write down notes, some of which I included. And you'll probably hear that there are moments when Simone Weil speaks, for example, and that's pretty much what she says, but I don't use it necessarily verbatim. In other words, I have to sort of reinvent slightly what she says, be true to what she said, but also bring it into the form of the poem. And in the case of this whole, The Mansions, the first book started in 2009. I finished it in 2023, so that's 14 years. Essentially, I had to find where I was going first, and I wanted to find that formally. So the kind of the general orientation came out pretty quickly that the whole thing would be written in tercettes, 3-line stanzas. It's 3-line stanzas all the way through. And then, because I'm a little bit of a numerological geek, I knew, based on the Divine Comedy, there's 3. I didn't know I was going to do 3 at first, but eventually I came to the notion, or really early on I came to the notion that 3-line stanzas, 8 3-line stanzas, so each section is 24 lines. And there are 3 parts to the first one, and 3 parts to the second one, and 3 parts to the third one, so that's 9. And there is a total of 99 sections, which is all divisible by 3. The lines are not pentameter lines. They're more like hexameter lines, so a little bit bulked out. That's 6 beats per line, which is dithyrambic, ancient Greek. I don't know ancient Greek, but I knew that form is a traditional size for epic poetry. But this isn't a traditional epic in any way. And the other thing I'd have to say is, back to the research portion of it, is there's a lot of events that you can find in a biography that may not actually be useful, right? It may be an interesting event, but it may not contribute anything, right? It may just be information, right? That's your point before. So to try and just find those spaces that are dramatically powerful, at least to me, and then try and make those events, from whatever point of view, dramatically powerful for the reader.
Yeah, both great questions. And if a follow-up, if you don't mind. So then how do you start out? Like, you're talking about that kind of tightness of structure. And obviously, that's what you work toward, and you get there. But for both of you, what's your process? Like, how do you start? Are you free writers? Do you do clusters? Do you do brainstorm? What do you do to get the ideas going that then you take off and shape the material that you have? Can you talk just a little bit about that, Tana, first, and then Daniel?
Okay, how I get started. So like I said, I have the notes, but
Yeah.
before I get to the notes, I need like the thing that interests me, and so it's very different from yours because I have to stumble upon something accidentally, like I'll hear about something, or I don't even remember how I found the seasteading website, but when I did find it, I was like, oh my gosh, this is crazy, I have to write about this.
What is the website?
Seasteading.
Oh,
And so things like that, or I'll see a headline that's interesting.
yeah.
And then I'll make my notes. That I have no idea why I write the research notes in freehand, and then I have to type the poems. So then I just start writing, and it's very slow process. Like I'll write a line, and maybe 20 minutes later I might write another one, and then it just sort of goes like that. So I don't know if that's a very appealing answer, but it's just a very slow. The screen is there, and I'm writing a few words at a time.
And then some of it gets tossed that you don't
Oh
use,
yeah, a lot of it
presumably.
gets
Yeah,
tossed.
yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
There's an essay that I often use with students called Four Temperaments in the Forms of Poetry. And one of those temperaments is structure, another is music, another is imagination, and it put forth as narrative. And made me reflect many years ago, and I still reflect on it, what my sort of leading temperament is. I think the idea of the essay is you got to do all of this stuff, and you got to work all of the muscles. But we all have a leading temperament, and I am absolutely certain my leading temperament is structure. I mean, I have written quite a few formal poems, but it's not about being formalist in any way. It's about my mind goes to the shape of the thing.
Yeah.
And that's just the nature of my mind. I mean, I didn't choose that. But of course, I want the music to be there. I want the narrative to be there. I want the imagination to go and invent things. But I first leaned structurally. So I think that's enabling to me, right? So that when I got the idea of the tercet, got to do the tercet, and just do it all the way through and let that be a shape that you can discover things through. That's just the way it happened. And I remember it happening pretty early on in the process. Okay, what am I going to do here? Started writing something that looks like a tercet, and I just kept on rolling with it. And then I said, I'm going to do that the whole way through. And it's a fairly arbitrary decision at some level, but maybe not in the sense that that's my inclination, so it's not entirely arbitrary.
Yeah, I think I saw something online. You called yourself, I may not get it exactly right, but something like a poet of architecture, or your poetry was architecture. But yeah, interesting, yeah. Thank you, both, yeah. Any other questions from you guys? Yeah, Peter. My husband.
Tana, what's in the curriculum that you teach to medical students? Is it ethics, literature, poetry?
It is literature. We read novels and short stories and some poems. And then the ethics comes through just conversation about the books. It's not very structured, it's organic. Sometimes I teach with a MD, and then that'll guide the conversation a little bit differently depending on what they're interested in, but it's very organic. With the medical students, it's just really, we have a book and we talk about it in terms of ethics or doctor-patient relationship or decisions that were made. There's a whole host of topics it could be about. Does that answer your question? Yeah. And then I do extracurricular creative writing workshops with them, or or I find them writers to come in, or they do painting, different humanities things, but that's about.
Thank you. Okay, well, if there are no more questions, thank you all again for coming. This is our last program for the season. We take a break over the summer, and then we'll start up again in September. So hope to see you then. And again, you can find the same program on our Dalí YouTube channel. Thank you all for coming out. Big round of applause, please, for Daniel and Tana. And I hope you'll go buy their books. They'll sign them for you. So thanks.